what I want to do, and I hope I can do it quickly, is give you an initial introduction to what is called Reformed Epistemology. See, everybody knows that there is Reformed theology out there, but how many people know about Reformed epistemology? What does the word epistemology mean, again? Epistemology, thank you, is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge. And of course, in your book we throw out all of those specifics. Here is something that is not only very interesting to me, and I hope to you, but it's also very exciting. Over the last 10 years, in the very best departments of philosophy in the country, discussed in the very top philosophy journals, has come a peculiar and a new and an exciting new approach to the theory of knowledge that has been developed by a group of Christian philosophers. You will hear their names again and again throughout the rest of the course. The premier individual in developing this approach to knowledge is Alvin Plantinga, who is an evangelical Christian who teaches philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. Now, what's interesting here, among other things, is the fact that this is an approach to knowledge that these thinkers believe can be traced back to the Reformation and to John Calvin. It is an exciting theory of knowledge because it presents a unique way of solving a number of difficult problems in philosophy that were crossed off as unsolvable for generations by many people. Reformed epistemology plays a very central role in this entire book. In fact, it's a little bit like a theme from a Tchaikovsky symphony. It keeps showing up. All right? You go on, you read it on pages 37 to 40, and then it fades into the background, and then before you know it, you're running into that same beautiful theme again in part 2 of the book and in part 3 of the book. Well, I just want to give you a brief introduction to Reformed epistemology. It begins with the recognition that human knowledge is made possible because of certain belief-forming mechanisms. Belief-forming mechanisms. I don't know that this is I don't know if this is the best language to use here, but because it sounds so artificial and so mechanical. But I think the language nonetheless conveys the point. I'm going to give you an example of a belief-forming mechanism in action. Restrain your enthusiasm, all right? Don't go crazy here. But watch me, all right? Open your eyes, whatever. I am going to clap my hands. Oh, I just did. I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to clap my hands in a moment, and you're going to hear a noise, of course. Well, let's see if we do it. Now notice there are two distinct happenings here. One is the clashing together of my hands and the noise, the sound. Now we could do this in other ways. For example, I could slap somebody's face, all right, and in which case we'd have a somewhat different set of experiences. We'd hear the noise and then someone would feel pain, all right, something like that. Once again, watch me. Anybody can do this. I assure me, trust me on this, all right? The clapping of the hands and the noise. I'm going to ask a simple question now, and I hope none of you disappoint me. How many of you believe, tell me the truth now, raise your hands. How many of you believe that the noise you heard was caused by the bringing together of my two hands? Let me see your... Are there any people who don't believe that the noise Now, notice that all of us reacted epistemologically in the same way to my question. Every one of you believed that there was a causal relationship between the clapping of the hands and the noise. Now, what accounts for that? The Reformed Epistemologist says, we are made in such a way that we cannot think otherwise. Human beings come into life already equipped with belief-forming mechanisms. And those belief-forming mechanisms account for the ways we think in the presence of certain experiences or data. I'll give you another example. I am holding up a carton of orange juice, apple juice. While I'm holding it up, I might as well take a sip here. All right. Now, every one of you, if you're looking at me right now, every one of you has in your mind an idea of the apple juice carton. Now notice there's a difference between the idea of the apple juice carton and the apple juice carton itself. It would be, if you had the actual carton in your head, you'd be in trouble. What you have in your head, in your consciousness, are ideas of the carton, right? So the carton, you think, is out here. It's in my hand. It's in the world outside of your mind. But the ideas that you have of the apple juice carton are in your mind. They are in your consciousness. Now, one of the persistent problems in the history of philosophy goes like this. I'm dripping apple juice on this expensive rug, which means I got to drink a little bit more of it. How do we know that the ideas in our minds correspond to the reality that is outside of our mind? Those of you who've taken the history of philosophy course, you should know something about that. How do I even know that there is a world that exists outside of my mind? That's one of the prevailing questions in the history of philosophy. Now, what Reformed Epistemology does by way of an answer to that is this. It says that we are made in such a way that we cannot help but think in that way. When we become aware of ideas in our mind, ideas that are present to our consciousness, we naturally assume that there is something in the world outside of our minds that corresponds to those ideas. And in fact, the only people who ever doubt that there is a world outside of their minds are those people who've been corrupted by some lousy philosophy course, right? The natural, uncorrupted individual takes the existence of the world outside of our minds for granted, and that's the way it should be. Now, to make a long story short, and you can then go on and read pages 37 and 40 to yourself, this idea of belief-forming mechanisms received a very influential expression in the 18th century at the hands of a Scottish philosopher named Thomas Reid. Thomas Reid, who wasn't always right in everything he said, let me point that out to you, exercised a strong influence on Presbyterian philosophy in America through the 19th century. His school of philosophy is sometimes known as common sense realism. And if you go back and you study the philosophical system that was taught at Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary in the 1800s, it would be Thomas Reid's common sense realism. Many of the thinkers who left Princeton Seminary to start what would become Westminster Theological Seminary in the late 1920s were also people who were influenced by common sense realism. But, as I will show you later in the Red Book, some people think that the basic elements of common sense realism can actually be traced back to Calvin and to certain ideas and theories in Calvin's thought. So this is the basic thing you need to know about Reformed epistemology. It answers many of the fundamental questions about epistemology in terms of belief-forming mechanisms which belong to every human being, which are not learned, which are not acquired, but which are part of the structure of our nature from birth, and which in fact are part of our created nature because God made us that way. That's the essence of Reformed epistemology. I have heard Alvin Plantinga speak to many non-Christian philosophers, and what he does so skillfully is show them how impossible it is to answer many of the crucial questions about philosophy, about epistemology, unless you presume the truth of Reformed epistemology. It's either this or skepticism. That seems to be the situation. Are Thomas Reid's belief-forming mechanisms simply another name for innate ideas or innate knowledge? It's easier for me to answer that question for some of you than for others. Those of you who've taken the History of Philosophy course know that your professor believes strongly, resolutely in the existence of innate ideas, and that human beings are born with those innate ideas because that's part of what it means to be created in the image of God. Now, you've asked the question, and I've got to answer it. Strictly speaking, Thomas Reid did not think of these belief-forming mechanisms in the same way that other philosophers think of innate ideas. That would be my major reservation about Thomas Reid. Okay? But nonetheless, as an innatist, as a philosophical rationalist, I can jump into his system and I can do some tinkering and I can make use of the same approach that he does and make it conform to certain things that those of you who are students of the history of philosophy know trace back to St. Augustine and to some other people. So there is a little difference there. Plantinga has no problem with innate ideas. He's a Platonist, he's an Augustinian, but there are some empiricists. Oh, pray for them. There are some empiricists running around the country, Christian empiricists, who break out in hives whenever you talk about innate ideas. But they don't know they don't see how this really does relate to innatism, and I'm going to drop it there. It does seem as if these belief-forming mechanisms are innate, are not acquired. They certainly are not acquired. They are part of our structure from birth. So how would they differ from innate ideas? They would differ in this way. Innate ideas have some kind of content to them. All right? In other words, I think the idea of God is innate, so that I do not just have a structure for forming an idea or concept of God. I think the very concept of God itself is innate to human beings if they know how to look for it. Okay? So this is not so much an idea as it is a kind of computer-like function which ends up producing the right ideas later on. I think some ideas themselves are innate. Thomas Reid tended to focus only on a mechanism. So that would be one difference. But we don't need to concern ourselves with that much detail. Okay? The next thing I want to do is turn my attention to the test of reason. We introduced you to 3 tests that should be used to evaluate any worldview. The first of those tests is the test of reason. I must now say a little bit more about the test of reason for several reasons. Reason number 1, some Christians have been corrupted. Here I go again. I'm sorry. I'm kidding, all right? I don't want to get any of you upset. But some Christians have been corrupted along the way by some bad teaching where they think that too much dependence upon the law of non-contradiction is not just unchristian, but perhaps is even positively blasphemous. So that's one reason why I think it's important here to do my best to save some of you from any further error with regard to the law of non-contradiction. And I'm smiling, all right? So if any of you are getting upset at me, I'm kidding you a little bit. The second reason why this is important is because this is such an important piece of information to use in apologetics that you must get it, you must be at home with the law of non-contradiction. So let me give you a better explanation of what the law of non-contradiction is, why it is absolutely essential for all human beings, and how you can use it in some apologetic arguments. Let me give you a definition, first of all, of the law of non-contradiction. A cannot be, and for some of you this will be repetition, but that's all right. It will reinforce it. A cannot be both B and non-B at the same time. Can you see it over there in the corner? And in the same sense. A cannot be both B and non-B at the same time and in the same sense. Now, I'm going to draw a picture on the board, and I hope it will be made available to the people listening by tape. The picture will help you better understand the difference between B and non-B. What I'm drawing on the board is a rectangle. And then inside the rectangle, I'm drawing, well, in this case, I'll draw a circle. I could have drawn something else, but I'll draw a circle. Now, we're going to represent this circle, we're going to call this circle inside of our rectangle the class of B, the set of B. And it doesn't matter what this class or what this set is. It could be anything. It could be the set of all trees. It could be the set of all human beings. It could be the set of all apple juice cartons. That's it. It could be the set of all pieces of chalk. Call it B. Now, everything else outside of that circle is non-B. This is very important because it is the failure to grasp this point that is at the root of so much confusion about the law of non-contradiction. Now, we have a name for non-B. We call it the complementary class. B, let's write it on the board. Non-B is the complement, P-L-E, of B. Understand that this rectangle represents the entire universe. All right. If anything exists, it exists in this rectangle. So that when we talk about non-B, we are talking about everything else in the universe that is not B. Now, suppose B is the class of all human beings. Then non-B would represent anything else in the universe that is not a human being. That means non-B includes trees and rocks and rivers and mountains and stars and photons, and that's not a bad word, all right? Anything else in the universe that isn't B. Now, when somebody denies the law of non-contradiction, they are asserting that something can be both B and non-B at the same time and in the same sense. And that is total, utter, irrevocable nonsense. Consider this proposition. Socrates is a man. All right? Now, what we're doing in this proposition is we are asserting that the individual Socrates is a member of the class B. He's a member of the class of man. If anybody denies the universal validity of the law of non-contradiction, they are, in effect, asserting that Socrates is not only a man, but at the same time and in the same sense, he is also a tree, a ship, a fish, a star, a mountain. He's everything in the universe at the same time and in the same sense. Now, that is the kind of nonsense that you get into when you don't pay sufficient attention to the law of non-contradiction. Incidentally, there's some very good stuff in the library that will amplify this for you. Pick out some books written by Gordon Clark. Take a look at Gordon Clark's Thales to Dewey, which says a lot about this. There's a book on reserve called The Philosophy of Gordon Clark that I edited that talks about this. Now, many people ask this question: can the law of non-contradiction be proven? Can you prove that it exists and that it is necessary? And the answer to that is a simple no. The reason why nobody can prove the truth and the necessity of the law of non-contradiction is a very simple reason. You can't prove the law of non-contradiction because any argument whatsoever has to presuppose the law of non-contradiction. In order to prove the law of non-contradiction, you would have to use the law of non-contradiction, and that would involve you in circular reasoning. So Aristotle recognized that it is impossible to produce a direct proof for the law of non-contradiction. However, Aristotle said it is possible, and indeed important, to realize that you can produce some indirect proofs for the law of non-contradiction. You can't prove it directly, but you can prove it indirectly by showing the nonsense that people would get into if they repudiated it. Now, here's what Aristotle did. He pointed out that the law of non-contradiction, let's put this on the board, the law of non-contradiction is, and I'll make 2 points here. First of all, the law of non-contradiction is necessary, must be presupposed, and must be used, is necessary for any significant thinking. Nobody can think properly who denies the law of non-contradiction, because if you do deny the law of non-contradiction, you're going to be mixing up B's and non-B's all over the map, all over the universe. Unless there's a difference between a man and a cat, a man and a dog, a man and a star, significant thinking is impossible. Indeed, I would go even further and say that you cannot even use language in a meaningful way unless you presuppose the law of non-contradiction. Let's put that up here. We'll just put the word language. The very person who denies the law of non-contradiction in speech or writing is presupposing the law of non-contradiction when he uses language. Because he's assuming that every predicate, every noun, every subject, every adjective, every pronoun means what it means and not something else. So trying to eliminate the law of non-contradiction is like trying to deny the existence of air at the very time that you're forced to breathe. I mean, watch me. The law of non-contradiction isn't necessary, all right? Notice, or let me use the other example. Air doesn't exist. Now, in order to utter the statement, air doesn't exist, I had to breathe. I had to get air in my lungs. That's the kind of self-defeating nonsense that exists when people deny the law of non-contradiction. Now, the last point that Aristotle made is this. The law of non-contradiction is necessary for significant action. It's necessary for significant action. Not only must there be a difference between be and non-be in sentences and propositions, and in reality, there's a difference between be and non-be when it comes to human behavior. You see, if somebody denies the law of non-contradiction, then there is no difference between driving on the right side of I-4 and driving on the left side of I-4, on the left side of the median. I want to submit to you that there is a difference. All right? Now, you know how well this road out here is patrolled in the morning by state troopers. Some morning, just try that, all right? Go down the other side of I-4. You will get the attention of the state troopers very quickly, see. They will take action if you survive, assuming you survive. Some Yankee snowbird sick 'em, right? Or try this example, all right? And some of you have heard this before, but it works. It works. Don't file a federal income tax return for 5 years or so, all right? And when you get called in for an audit, try this excuse with the IRS auditor. Say to her or him that you used to file your 1040s every year until you learn that the law of non-contradiction doesn't apply in this world. And thus you learn that there's no difference between be and non-be, between filing a 1040 and not filing a 1040, see? Now the IRS agent will say, that's a very interesting argument. I've heard some doozies in my lifetime, but I've never heard that one. And then she will say, okay, let's assume that you're right. If you don't think there's a difference between filing a tax return and not filing a tax return, then you will also not think there's a difference between going to jail and not going to jail. Okay? In a sense, it's almost criminal that we have to waste some important time talking about the law of non-contradiction, but there are a lot of irrational people out there, New Age people. Listen, the New Age, one of its major features is its repudiation of the laws of logic. People who are I see a lot of hands raising here. Let me just finish these points. People who are adherents of Eastern religions repudiate the law of non-contradiction. And it's because they repudiate the law of non-contradiction that they can say, well, you can believe in your Jesus and I can believe in my Jesus. Or your beliefs can be true and my beliefs can be true at the same time. No, they cannot be true. Contradictory beliefs cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. Right now I'm trying to write a book on what we call religious pluralism, which is the belief that all of the major religions of the world are, well, let's define it in this, are equally true at the same time. Well, friends, you've got to sacrifice your reason and you've got to repudiate the notion of truth that is, as it is commonly understood, if you're going to buy that line of thinking. Doesn't the law of non-contradiction presuppose a world in which arguments are possible? I think it's the other way around. The belief that arguments are possible presupposes a world in which the law of non-contradiction obtains. The law of non-contradiction is basic for so many common human activities: reasoning, drawing inferences, making judgments about truth and falsity. So the law of non-contradiction is the basic principle here, and everything else would be built on that. Pluralism, I must deal with it more competently. It invites us to dig below the surface, and what it ends up saying is that we really can't know the real truth about God, and so we must simply accept all of these apparently conflicting religious claims. The catch you have to run in, the problem you run into, though, is this. a certain kind of Buddhist says that God is really identical with the world. It's pantheism. And Christians, Jews, and Muslims say, and some Hindus and other types of Buddhists say, that God is distinct from the world. All right? Now, the big problem for anybody who wants to be a serious pluralist is, what concept of God can encompass both of those claims? If God, claim 1, God is everything. Claim 2, God is distinct from the created world. What concept of God can possibly, what circle is big enough to include those two claims? And my answer is, there is no circle big enough to do that. Yeah. I'm saying the Christian assumes the responsibility of showing that nothing he believes is logically contradictory. And you'd better be able to do that. You'd better be able to do that with vis-a-vis the Trinity or vis-a-vis the two natures of Christ or whatever. And I think it can be done. But I've been immersing myself in this pluralist literature now for over a year, and nobody has done that. What they take refuge in is total skepticism about the nature of God, and they just say, well, of course, none of us are presently capable of conceiving how both of those propositions can be true at the same time, that God can be everything and God can be distinct. We can't conceive. Well, so that's what you really have to do, I think, is arrive at some consensus about the law of non-contradiction. What these pluralists really do is eliminate the whole category of truth from religion. They really do. There are lots of things going on in their system, and I think it is to Christianity's advantage that it is willing to stand up and say, I believe in the law of non-contradiction, and I am willing to subject Christian dogma, Christian doctrine, to the test of the law of non-contradiction. You may find nonsense in some other set of religious beliefs, but you're not going to find it in Christianity. All right? I think that ought to make some people sit up and take notice. Well, the law of non-contradiction, don't repudiate it. Don't leave home without it. Amen.